The air in the shack tasted like rot and burnt plastic. Ghost leaned close to the map table, ignoring the sweat that pooled under his flak jacket and dripped onto the acetate overlay of the A Shau Valley. Major Hayes, a man who hadn't seen anything hotter than a Saigon bar fight in 6 months, traced a line with a grease pencil, a line that cut directly through the known primary logistics hub of NVA Group 701. This is a no-go zone, Kincaid. MCV scrubbed the recovery 3 hours ago. The risk profile is astronomical, and frankly, the asset is considered expendable. Hayes didn't look Ghost in the eye. He looked at the coffee cup he was stirring with unnecessary vigor. The asset wasn't expendable to Ghost. Captain Elias Vance, call sign Saber 1, was a long-range recon specialist who knew the supply lines and I-Corps better than the rats that lived in them. He'd been shot down 4 days ago, a mile shy of the Laotian border, deep inside the darkest corner of the valley, and the last coherent transmission they picked up was a ragged whisper of coordinates followed by static and a distant crackle of AK fire. The mission had been officially designated Kia/body recovery only 2 days ago, but Ghost had seen the raw intel reports. The enemy was pulling out all the stops to find Vance, meaning he had something priceless on him, or in his head. Ghost looked at his team huddled in the corner. Doc, meticulously sharpening his surgical tools. Spider, the RTO, sitting quiet as a stone, checking the frequency scramblers. And the twins, Hicks and Riker, polishing their M16S as if they were museum pieces. 5 men against a division. Expunge this conversation from the log. Major. Ghost said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, the calmness itself a threat. We heard nothing about MCV standing down. We are going in to confirm Kia. If we find a pulse, we bring him home. Hayes finally met his gaze, his face a mask of nervous fear mixed with resentment. He knew Ghost operated outside the lines, and he also knew Ghost always got the job done, regardless of the cost of protocol. The cost to the men, however, was always Ghost's burden alone. Hayes nodded curtly, wiping the sweat from his brow. You get confirmation, Kincaid. You get a picture, you tag the body, and you get out. If you call for extraction with a live man, I never saw this map. I never saw you. Understood. The unspoken contract was sealed. A forbidden extraction, a high-value asset, and a complete denial from command if it went sideways. Ghost just clipped the map to his webbing. The heat was a physical oppression, promising rain that never cooled, only intensified the stink of the dense, primordial jungle. It was the A Shau, where the sun never reached the ground and every shadow held a rifle. They would be ghosts in the green hell, hunting another ghost. The UH-1D model dropped them into a sodden clearing that lasted barely 10 seconds before the rotors chewed through the thick canopy and the jungle swallowed the sound of the departing bird. The humidity hit like a wet fist. Visibility was immediate zero. They were 5 clicks west of the previous extraction point, deliberately dropped into a cold area miles from the objective to cover their approach. The initial movement was a symphony of controlled noise, the rhythmic splash of boots in the thick mud, the soft click of weapon safeties being released, the faint rustle of heavy canvas packs scraping against the elephant grass. Hicks, leading point, used his machete sparingly. Every cut was a sound report that traveled impossibly far in the stifling stillness. Ghost moved immediately behind him, his eyes constantly scanning the triple canopy roof, looking for the impossible, sunlight or a sign of wires. The A Shau Valley wasn't just hostile, it was intelligent. It was a net woven by the NVA for years, every trail booby-trapped, every ridge line monitored. They moved along a ridge crest, aiming to drop into a ravine that fed into the main river. Vance's last known location was near the river junction. Doc kept a steady pace, conserving energy, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew he might have to carry 100 pounds of gear and an unconscious man out on his back. Spider, the RTO, walked backwards occasionally, checking their 6, using the small mirror taped to his rifle barrel to peer into the dense foliage that was already closing back in behind them. 2 hours in, they hadn't seen a thing, which only amplified Ghost's anxiety. Silence in the A Shau was never benign. It was the sound of a coil being tightened. Ghost stopped the team using a hand signal that meant halt, observe, listen. He lowered himself slowly onto one knee, the dampness immediately soaking through his trousers. He felt it before he heard it, the faint, metallic scent of canned rations and cheap tobacco, carried on a slight, imperceptible draft. They were near a path, perhaps a rarely used supply route. He signaled Hicks to drop low and confirm. Hicks crawled forward 10 feet, flattened himself against the wet earth, and then slowly raised 2 fingers. 2 men walking away from them. Ghost signaled patience. He didn't want a firefight. A single shot would sterilize the entire area, drawing every scout within a 2-mile radius. They waited, submerged in the oppressive quiet, listening to the heavy, liquid sounds of the jungle. The buzz of insects, the splash of rain runoff, and the steady, sickening thrum of their own hearts. They waited for 15 agonizing minutes until the sounds of the NVA patrol faded entirely, merging back into the ambient noise. They crossed the path quickly, leaving no trace, moving like shadows that had simply absorbed the light. Every step closer to Vance was a step deeper into the enemy's grasp, and Ghost knew they were walking straight into the jaws of the trap. The deeper they pushed into the valley floor, the more the jungle transformed from a dense green obstacle into a sentient enemy. The foliage was so thick that the only way to navigate was by compass, bearing, and counting steps, trusting the map entirely, since visual checkpoints were non-existent. Ghost found himself falling into the mental rhythm required for deep infiltration. Absolute focus on the next 3 feet, filtering out the constant irritation of mud, insects, and the grinding weight of survival. His mind, however, kept cycling back to Vance. Vance was the reason Ghost was still here. 3 years earlier, during a disastrous operation near Key Sand, Vance had risked court-martial to override a botched fire mission that would have obliterated Ghost's entire team. Now, Ghost was returning the favor, regardless of Mac's decree. The debt was not negotiable. It was the only code that mattered here, the one written in blood, not regulation. Hicks suddenly froze, raising a shaking hand. He pointed down. Nestled among the roots of a giant banyan tree was a faint, nearly invisible strand of fishing line, connected to a single, rusted grenade pin. A tripwire. Riker, the demolitions man, silently eased forward and deactivated the device, his movements almost balletic in their precision. It was an NVA signature, old, deliberately set, and meant to slow down pursuit. But they weren't being pursued. They were moving toward the main complex. This meant the NVA had expected people here previously, or they were simply covering every conceivable approach. As Riker secured the grenade, Spider's handset crackled almost imperceptibly, muffled by a headset in Ghost's cupped hand. It was a tight beam transmission, scrambled and coded, barely a whisper of signal. "It's Vance," Spider mouthed, his eyes wide. The transmission was weak, intermittent, repeating a burst of numbers. It was a modification of a standard survival code, indicating injured, fixed position, cannot move. The location confirmed they were on the right track, but the distance remaining was critical, 800 meters, directly through what the NVA likely considered their own barracks. The signal had been transmitted within the last 30 minutes, meaning Vance was still mobile enough to send the burst, but his inability to transmit a full message suggested severe injury or enemy proximity. Ghost felt a sick lurch in his gut. They had to hurry, but hurrying meant tripping more wires, running into more patrols. The duality of the mission pressed down, the need for speed versus the need for silence. Ghost looked at his team, their faces etched with fatigue and fear, masked by professional resolve. "We shed packs. Take ammo, water, medic bags only. Riker, you cover the path. Hicks, lead us down the ravine. We move silent, we move fast. We have 800 meters of hell to cross to reach that man, and we're gonna cross it like ghosts, or we're gonna die trying to save him. There is no middle ground in this valley." They ditched the excess gear, burying it quickly beneath a cluster of thick ferns, marking the spot only with subtle, natural signifiers that only they would recognize. The immediate weight reduction was a relief, but the awareness that they were now operating without comfortable contingency fueled a sharper sense of urgency. They plunged into the ravine, a muddy chute that offered some concealment but channeled them directly into the path of any enemy patrolling the waterway. The silence lasted only another 50 meters before the green hell opened up with shocking suddenness. Hicks stepped onto a patch of earth that looked stable but gave way instantly beneath his weight, not into mud, but into a pungy pit, a shallow, covered trap lined with sharpened, feces-smeared stakes. He stopped his fall just short, catching himself on the lip, his breath hitching. Before Ghost could react, a single sharp burst of automatic fire tore through the air from the thick brush above them. The NBA had been watching the pit, waiting for the stumble. Riker, positioned slightly behind, reacted instantly, sweeping his M16 toward the muzzle flash and returning 3 precise rounds. The shooting stopped, but the silence didn't return. Instead, the deep, guttural cry of a water buffalo, a known NVA signal for contact, echoed down the ravine. Hicks, shaken but miraculously unharmed, scrambled out of the pit. They were compromised. "Doc, Riker, take the lead. We run," Ghost screamed, realizing they had to trade silence for speed. They broke cover, slipping and sliding down the slick, rocky bed of the ravine, the sound of their movement now reckless, desperate. Another burst of fire followed, closer this time, tearing leaves and bark off the trees above their heads. Spider stumbled, clutching his shoulder, the heavy radio pack swinging wildly. Doc was instantly on him, dragging him toward the cover of an overgrown rock outcropping. The wound was bad, a clean through and through high in the deltoid, but bleeding heavily. Spider was conscious, his face pale beneath the mud and sweat. Ghost laid down suppression fire, emptying half a magazine into the direction of the enemy fire, buying Doc precious seconds to apply a pressure bandage. The ambush hadn't killed them, but it had wounded their most critical asset, the RTO, and confirmed that the enemy knew their general direction and speed. Ghost realized this wasn't just a patrol, this was a response. The NVA were expecting them, perhaps alerted by Vance's radio burst, or perhaps they had been monitoring their drop zone from the beginning. They had lost the element of surprise entirely. The mission had just changed from a covert rescue to a fighting withdrawal that hadn't even started yet. They managed to drag Spider 30 meters further down the ravine before they were forced to hide. The heavy rainfall began, a tropical deluge that, ironically, helped mask the smell of the blood and the sound of Doc working on Spider, but also turned the ravine into a churning river of brown silt and debris. Doc finished stabilizing the wound, giving Spider a shot of morphine. Spider, though groggy, refused to relinquish his radio. He lay tucked under a small overhang, the rain beating down relentlessly on the jungle floor outside their shelter. Ghost sat beside him, cleaning his rifle, his mind calculating the impossible odds. They were 300 meters from Vance's signal, pinned down with one man wounded, and the enemy closing in fast, using the cover of the rain to maneuver. This was the moment where every soldier had to confront the terrible calculus of survival. The mission was now overtly forbidden, completely compromised, and success meant almost certain annihilation. Ghost looked at Riker and Hicks, their eyes reflecting the same question. Is one man worth all of us? It was a question that plagued every patrol leader in Vietnam, the moment where the rules of war dissolve into the raw instinct of brotherhood. If Ghost called for extraction now, citing a medical emergency and confirming enemy contact, they might get a bird in, but Vance would be left behind, captured or killed. If they pushed forward, they might save Vance, but they would certainly sacrifice the team's integrity, likely losing several men in the process and potentially subjecting Vance to torture before they even reached him. The silence under the overhang was oppressive, broken only by the hiss of the rain and Spider's shallow breathing. Ghost thought of the orders he defied, the careers he was risking, and the lives he was holding in his hands. He thought of the young men back home who would never know the moral compromises made in this steaming, forgotten jungle. He thought of the debt he owed Vance, a debt that outweighed every regulation and every life expectancy projection. Is the life of one man, especially a man carrying priceless knowledge, truly worth the sacrifice of an entire rescue team when every authority has ordered you to stand down? What is the limit of loyalty when survival itself is on the line? Ghost needed to know what the team thought, but the decision rested entirely on his shoulders. He felt the crushing weight of command, a weight heavier than his pack, heavier than the M60 he carried. He looked at Doc, the medic, the most pragmatic of them all. Doc just shook his head slightly, adjusting Spider's fore-drip, confirming the terrible reality. They were past the point of safe retreat. They had only one way left to go, and it was forward. As the light began to fail, painting the jungle in shades of bruised purple and deep, oily green, the rain slackened, giving way to a dripping, eerie stillness. The reduction in noise was worse than the storm, allowing every rustle, every crack of a twig to sound like a mortar round. Ghost decided they would move immediately. The NVA would be expecting them to wait until midnight. A dust push was reckless, but potentially surprising. Riker took point, moving with agonizing slowness, his eyes trained on the ground, searching for tripwires and pressure plates. They were forced to move parallel to the mainstream, which was now too treacherous to follow directly. The terrain here was littered with ancient, moss-covered karst formations, turning the movement into a vertical nightmare of slippery rock faces and hidden crevasses. They were moving through the perimeter of the NVA staging area. The atmosphere changed palpably. The wild, untamed jungle gave way to a subtle organization. They passed discarded remnants, a bent cigarette butt, a frayed piece of rope used for securing cargo, and then, unmistakable, the smell of cooking rice and wood smoke, faint but definite. They were within 200 meters of the main body of enemy forces. Ghost used hand signals to call the team into a tight huddle beneath a massive slab of rock. Spider, though heavily medicated, managed to relay the new coordinates of Vance's signal. It hadn't moved. He was still fixed. Hicks checked his magazine count, his breath clouding in the sudden temperature drop. Ghost checked his weapon, ensuring the flash suppressor was fully secure. They were trading soft footsteps for inevitable hard contact. Ghost crept forward alone, using the dense cover of a thicket of bamboo. He found the crash site first. It wasn't a wreck, it was fragments. Vance's O-2 Skymaster had been shot apart, scattering debris over a wide area. But the main pieces had been deliberately dragged away, confirming NVA involvement in the aftermath. But wait, there was blood, dried and black on the splintered wood. Far more blood than one man should survive losing. And then Ghost saw it, a boot print distinct from the local NVA sandals, a U.S. Army-issued jungle boot, dragging slightly, leading away from the crash site toward a cluster of dense elephant grass 40 meters away. Vance hadn't been captured at the crash site. He had fought, he had run, and he was close. Ghost signaled the team forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, a mixture of adrenaline and pure, desperate relief. The mission was still alive. They closed the gap, moving inch by agonizing inch, the oppressive quiet broken only by the chirping of crickets that Ghost knew were wrong. Too rhythmic, too artificial. They were being watched, and they were walking into a perfect dark ambush. The crickets weren't crickets. They were NVA signals, clicking softly between unseen scouts positioned along the periphery of the makeshift camp. Ghost led the final few meters, moving past a rough, thatched lean-to used for equipment storage. And there he was, Captain Elias Vance, pressed into the root structure of a huge, ancient fig tree, barely visible, his face obscured by a week's growth of beard, dirt, and dry blood. He was clutching a rusty AK-47, which was a dangerous sign in itself. Where did he get an AK? Vance's leg was severely injured, wrapped crudely in what looked like torn parachute silk, pinned beneath a twisted piece of fuselage metal. He looked like a dying animal, but his eyes were alive, darting, focused. Ghost slid up next to him, placing a reassuring, heavy hand on Vance's shoulder. Vance flinched, then recognized the American uniform, his face dissolving into a mixture of terror and relief. "They know," Vance croaked, his voice raw. "They know you're here." The radio burst. They triangulated the moment I sent it. "This position is bait. They let me stay here because they knew the Americans would be stupid enough to try and get me out." His eyes flickered toward a dark shadow beneath a low-hanging vine. "They left me the AK and water to keep me alive. They've been waiting for the chopper, waiting for the extraction point to be revealed. The immediate danger wasn't the men surrounding them. It was the trap set for the rescue bird." Vance confirmed the intel. He had been carrying satellite reconnaissance plans for the entire NVA logistics line into the DMZ, critical information that, if confirmed, could cripple the supply chain for months. The NVA commander knew this and was banking on command prioritizing the intel over the lives of the soldiers. But they were wrong. Ghost didn't care about the intel. He cared about the man. "Can you walk, Captain?" Ghost whispered. Vance shook his head, wincing in agony. "No, cerfiant. Not a chance. The femur is gone. We need an LZ cleared, and we need it now, before they realize I told you." Ghost looked at Doc, who confirmed with a grim nod that Vance was too heavy and too broken to carry effectively for any distance. They had 150 meters to the nearest plausible, relatively open ground that could possibly serve as an LZ, and that patch of ground was inevitably surrounded by NVA fighting positions. "Spider, calling in," Ghost ordered, his voice low but firm. "Code green. Immediate extraction. Confirm hot LZ, but give the original coordinates. Force them to divert. Tell them we are moving to the alternate, improvised LZ in 5 minutes. We need a fast mover, low-angle approach, guns firing. Tell them to bring the noise. Riker, set up the claymores. Hicks, cover the north approach. Doc, get ready to move the captain. We are leaving nothing behind but corpses." Spider, despite the pain, worked the radio with frightening clarity, sending the coded burst back to MACV. He requested a low-level, high-speed extraction at the original, compromised coordinates, but he followed that with a secondary transmission detailing the real, makeshift LZ, a dried-up rice paddy carved into the hillside a short dash away. It was a risky gamble, hoping the initial feint would draw the heaviest fire, giving the second bird a chance to swoop in. The moment Spider confirmed the transmission was received, the jungle exploded. It wasn't the haphazard gunfire of a patrol. It was a coordinated, overwhelming volume of automatic weapons fire ripping through the vines and trees toward their position. The NBA trap was sprung, and they knew exactly where Ghost's team was hunkered down. Hicks let out a sharp cry as a burst stitched across his flank. He stumbled but stayed upright, immediately returning fire with focused intensity. Riker detonated the first claymore, a massive concussion that sprayed 300 steel ball bearings into the brush, momentarily silencing that sector and buying them crucial seconds. Ghost laid down a deafening, sustained sheet of fire with his M60, ripping apart the bamboo and splintering the smaller trees, forcing the NVA to keep their heads down. Doc was already working on Hicks, applying a quick field dressing, then turning his attention back to Vance. They had to move. "Riker, below the rest. Cover us." Ghost screamed over the din. Riker emptied his demolition bag, setting off a chain reaction of directional mines designed to funnel the enemy away from the LZ. Ghost hoisted the injured Vance onto his back, using Vance's webbing to secure him, a heavy, dead weight of broken bones and fear. "Let's move." They sprinted through the remaining jungle, the gunfire chasing their heels, the air thick with spent casings and the acrid smell of burning powder. Ghost felt the exhaustion ripping into his muscles, carrying the combined weight of his M60, his pack, and the captain, but the adrenaline was a terrible, beautiful fuel. They burst out onto the open rice paddy, not flat, but uneven, muddy, and horrifyingly exposed. The NVA had excellent firing positions all around the perimeter. Ghost dropped Vance and immediately dove for cover behind a raised dike firing short, controlled bursts from the M60 to keep the enemy heads down. The sound of the chopper was now discernible, a distant, growing thumping that promised either salvation or execution. It was too far away. The next 10 minutes were reduced to a desperate, primal cycle of shooting, dragging, and counting bullets. The NVA were closing, flanking their position from the tree line that bordered the paddy. They needed heavy suppressive fire, something sustained to keep the perimeter clear for the chopper's approach. Spider, lying prone near the radio, called out ranges and adjusted fire, despite the morphine dulling his senses. Hicks, bleeding but still mobile, held the north flank with dogged determination. Ghost was nearly out of ammunition for the M60, his shoulders screaming from the recoil. The extraction bird, a medevac Huey, was suddenly in sight, approaching fast, low over the trees, but it was coming in on the wrong vector, the original compromised coordinates. Ghost realized their deception had worked, but it meant the secondary bird was delayed. The Huey, distracted by the volume of fire at the false LZ, banked hard, drawing a hail of fire. Ghost shouted into the radio, the static crackling against his ear. Negative, negative. We are at the secondary LZ. Paddy, Paddy, get to the paddy. The chopper pilot, a young man who sounded terrified, acknowledged the message, pulling a tight, impossible maneuver over the trees toward their true location. But the NVA were ready. They opened up with everything they had, RPS fire, heavy machine guns, everything focused on the loud, vulnerable intrusion. The side of the Huey sparkled with incoming rounds. It was going to crash before it reached them. They had to buy it more time. Ghost looked at his team, faces covered in mud and sweat and grim resolve. He looked at Riker, the demolitions man, who met his gaze with a knowing nod. Riker was the most pragmatic, the most technically sound. He knew the odds. He spoke before Ghost could even issue the order. I'll draw the fire, Ghost. Get Vance on the bird. I'll secure the back door. He didn't ask. He stated it as a necessary function of the mission. Riker grabbed all the remaining fragmentation grenades and claymores, checked the action on his rifle, and sprinted toward the dense tree line where the heaviest fire was coming from, heading straight into the heart of the ambush. Ghost didn't stop him. He couldn't. He watched Riker disappear, a fleeting image of sacrifice, before turning his focus back to the chopper, which was now hovering precariously over the mud, taking continuous fire. Ghost and Hicks dragged Vance toward the skids, lifting the captain's dead weight onto the floor of the bird. The door gunner was already hit, slumped over his weapon. The noise was deafening, the air thick with the smell of aviation fuel and spent powder. As Vance was secured, Riker's grenades started going off in rapid succession near the tree line, followed by a final, massive blast, likely the last of his claymores, and then silence from that direction. A terrible, permanent silence. The extraction was brutal. As soon as Vance was aboard, Ghost signaled the pilot, screaming into the headset, "Go, go, go." The Huey rose violently, pitching sideways as the pilot pulled up and away, defying the laws of aerodynamics and gravity. As they cleared the tree line, Ghost looked back. He saw nothing but the muddy rice paddy, the ravaged jungle perimeter, and the swirling smoke where Riker had made his final, heroic stand. There was no time to grieve, no time to look for Riker's body. They were still receiving heavy fire from the valley walls as the chopper struggled for altitude. Spider, having mustered his last reserve of strength, was already applying pressure to the wound of the slumped door gunner, trying to triage the wounded while the bird shook around him. Hicks was vomiting in the back, the shock and pain of his wounds finally overwhelming him. Ghost just sat on the floor, holding Vance's hand, a pointless, desperate gesture of solidarity, as the valley, that dark, unforgiving maw, receded beneath the rotor wash. The transition from the hell of the A Shau to the relatively secure airbase outside Annam was jarring. The silence in the debriefing room was clinical, stark, and utterly deafening. Vance was whisked away to surgery, his intel secure and his conscious transfer to the medical staff. Ghost and the surviving team, Doc, Hicks, and Spider, were sequestered. Major Hayes appeared, his face rigid. He didn't ask about Riker. He didn't ask about Hick's wound. He asked about the protocols. Kincaid, you violated a direct standing order. You went in for a recovery mission that was scrubbed. You called in an unauthorized medevac. We lost a bird. We lost a man. Explain the discrepancy in the LZ report. Ghost stared at him, the exhaustion a tangible thing. He placed the heavy M60 on the table. We confirmed the Kia's status of Captain Vance, sir. The radio contact was a pre-recorded emergency burst. We were compromised on the approach. We sustained casualties. We secured the area, confirmed the body, and secured the area around the remains. Riker was lost, securing the perimeter against overwhelming numbers. Captain Vance was discovered alive when we were clearing the perimeter, and he was immediately prioritized for extraction due to high-value intelligence he possessed, which was critical to command. It was a lie, constructed to protect the living and sanctify the sacrifice of the dead. It was the only way to ensure Vance was recognized as a hero, and that the team wasn't court-martialed for insubordination. Hayes looked skeptical, but the sight of Vance in the infirmary and the undeniable success of the intelligence recovery gave him pause. He nodded slowly. The record will reflect that your team executed an unauthorized confirmation mission with extreme valor. You will be recommended for commendation, and the incident will be closed as a necessary combat loss. Do you understand, Sergeant? Ghost understood perfectly. The rules of war were always malleable, bending only to successful outcomes. They had sacrificed Riker's life and their own moral high ground, but they had saved Vance and the team's operational integrity. The cost was paid, and the ledger was closed in blood and lies. The war swallowed heroes whole, sometimes immediately, sometimes slowly through silence and paperwork.